So, my name is Konrad Twee, and I'm the resident historian at the Sydney Jewish Museum. A very warm welcome to all of you for being here this afternoon at the Sydney Jewish Museum to attend the launch of Graham Blewitt's book, Justice and War Crimes. A special welcome to two elders from the Campbelltown area, Uncle Billy Bell, who will do the acknowledgement to country, accompanied by Auntie Jo Maid. Both elders are close friends of you, Graham, and you have worked with them at the Juvenile Justice Department in Campbelltown, most recently at your last position as a magistrate in Campbelltown at the Children's Court. Welcome. Thank you. Billy Bell and Auntie Jo Maid.
Auntie Joyce has refused to speak, so I've got to say a few words on her behalf. So I'd like to say that Graham asked me to do the Welcome to Country here at the Jewish Museum some months ago. And I sent him an email back and I said, Graham, I can't do that for you because protocol says that you have to get a Aboriginal elder from this area. I said, I can do the acknowledgement to country. And he said, I'd be honoured if you'd done that for me. And I said, well, I'll come in and do that for you because Graham and I have become really true friends over the past 7 or 8 years, and I've got a lot of time for Graham and his family. So I'll speak about myself for a couple of minutes and then I'll do the acknowledgement. My name's Billy Bell. I was born a Wiradjuri warrior back in 1959 under the Flora and Fauna Act, so I wasn't an Aboriginal person in this country until 1967 when the referendum was. So I've been fighting the good fight for Aboriginal people ever since, and I just happened to work for Juvenile Justice, so I've been there for about 33 years. And when I got to meet Mr. Blewitt, I did tell him all these things that I'm telling you people today. I recruited Auntie Joyce Maid as an Aboriginal mentor 25 years ago. She's retired 3 times and came back 3 times, and she's still with us. So, and that's good to see too. She's only recently just lost her husband, but she's still working the good fight with juvenile justice. So without any further ado, I'll do an acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd also like to acknowledge every other Aboriginal person that's in this room, elders past and present. I'd like to honour the Blewitt family for giving me the opportunity to speak today, and I'd like to acknowledge all my non-Indigenous brothers and sisters that are here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Billy. Thank you very much, Uncle Bill Bell and Auntie Jo Maid. Let me now briefly introduce the two partners in dialogue who together launched Graham's book. All victims deserve justice. I repeat that. All victims deserve justice. This is a leading and guiding leitmotif behind Graham Blewitt's long and remarkable legal career within the field of law enforcement. After enjoying as student Boy Scouting and being a keyboard player, athletics and playing rugby league, and as far as I know, you still are a supporter of the Bulldogs. You embarked your legal career within the DPP, the Department of Public Prosecution, investigating and prosecuting national and international drug traffickers, members of organized crime gangs. Graham then investigated and prosecuted police officers involved in corrupt activities. In 1987, he was appointed Deputy director of the SIU, the Special Investigations Unit, Australia's Nazi War Crimes Commission, established by the Hawke government and entrusted with the task of investigating all the war crimes allegations made against Australians and Australian residents, and to prepare cases for trial. After the resignation of Bob Greenwood, you took over the helm of the SIU. And once the SIU was shut down by the Keating government, you and some of your team here in Sydney were entrusted with another task, investigating and prosecuting modern genocidal killers. Moving to The Hague, Graham has served for 10 years as Deputy Prosecutor at the United Nations War Crimes Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. The book that we are launching today tells the untold story of these 10 years, bringing perpetrators to justice, justice that the victims and their families so wholly deserved. At the end of these 10 years, Graham returned to Australia, as just mentioned, to serve as a judge, as a magistrate, handing down verdicts at a children's court. All victims deserve justice. This leitmotif might also apply to Chris Masters, who has played a pivotal role in the field of journalism and the media. Chris Masters has been one of the most renowned and successful investigative journalists and authors in this country. He can point to over 100 investigations and reports, earning multiple awards and appointments, including an associate professorship in journalism and an honorary doctorate, to mention only a few career highlights. Joining the ABC's Four Corner in 1983, his report on the Big League revealed the corruption in rugby league and in politics, leading to the Street Royal Commission. 1 year later, his report on the French Connection caused international headlines, exposing the French government's involvement in the bombing and the sinking of the Greenpeace ship, the Rainbow Warrior in New Zealand. He then shed light on the Moonlight State, leading to the Fitzgerald inquiry into corruption in Queensland. And finally, Chris Masters spent many years investigating the war in Afghanistan and the war crimes committed. He exposed and I think I'm using now a German term, dethroned. Is that an English word too? Dethroned? Ben Roberts-Smith, Australia's most decorated living soldier. Roberts-Smith lost his defamation case largely due to the documentary evidence presented by Chris Masters. And among your books, I think one stands now out, entitled Flawed Hero, Truth, Lies, and War Crimes. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the two partners in dialogue.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'd like to pick up on that theme, all victims deserve justice. Was there some personal motivation here? Is there a story from your past where I remember when I was covering the war in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, and interviewed Graham at The Hague many years ago. I'd come out of a little village in Bosnia, and there was only two survivors, a boy and a girl who'd hidden out in the bush, and that whole village slaughtered one another in the year preceding. They'd lived harmoniously together. It shocked me to the core. And the following year, I was in Rwanda and covered the genocide there, and you just can't get over those experiences. What for you?
If I just may indulge myself for a moment before I answer your question, Chris, I just want to acknowledge my dear wife, who is currently in hospital with pneumonia. She was going to be here today, and I know she's watching on the live stream, so I send her my very best wishes, and hope you get well soon, and we'll see you later tonight. I also want to thank everyone for coming. I'm overwhelmed at your presence here today, and thank you for your kind words, Conrad. Chris, there was no single incident that motivated me. I think it was more a career progression as opportunities arose. I took advantage of those opportunities, but while doing the Nazi war crimes investigations, hearing the stories of the people who were the victims of the massacres that took place in the Second World War sort of struck a chord. Then when the SIU was wound up, as Conrad had said, I went to The Hague to join the ICTY, the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal, and there were countless stories of people who had suffered greatly. And one sticks in my mind, as Chris mentioned, there were villages that lived in harmony before the conflicts broke out in Bosnia, and it was Serbian and Croatian neighbours living together in harmony, and one's religion didn't mean anything. But with Milosevic's sowing of his poisonous propaganda, the ordinary people within Bosnia believed that if they didn't take action to kill their Serb or Croatian neighbours, then they would kill them, which really started the killing spree. And there was one particular incident that took place in the village of Stupni Do that I remember very vividly. There was a Bosnian Muslim neighbour and his Croatian Bosnian Serb neighbour, and they used to meet regularly on weekends for barbecues. But one night the Bosnian found himself invaded by his Croatian neighbour and the Bosnian police. They gathered up this man's family. They tied the man to a chair. And because my young grandchildren are here, I won't say what they did to the wife and daughters, but you can imagine. And at the end of that, the wife and the daughters were killed while this man was tied up sitting in the chair watching what was happening. And the police then left, leaving this man to live with that memory of his family being slaughtered. In that particular incident, it was not a unique circumstance, unfortunately. It was a fairly common occurrence. But when I heard that story very early in the piece, that really drove home to me the need to bring justice to the people that had suffered the barbaric crimes that were being committed in Bosnia and in Croatia. So, Chris, that in many ways was sort of motivated me more and more to continue the work that we were doing in The Hague.
Congratulations, it's a great book. I shouldn't have been perhaps surprised, but I was surprised to read about how the United Nations dragged its heels when it came to the establishment of the International Criminal Court. Why was that?
I've often puzzled over that question myself, and I think the answer lies in the fact that the Office of Legal Affairs in the United Nations in New York They were responsible for drafting the statute of the tribunal that created the tribunal in the first place. So I think they saw themselves as being the controlling factor, if you like, making sure that any work that the tribunal did was at their instigation and under their control. I turned up in The Hague. Maybe it was a good thing, the fact that New York was about 10 hours behind The Hague in terms of each day. So if a crisis arose in the morning in The Hague, I had to work out how to deal with that crisis and not wait until 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon to get permission from New York. So I think in undertaking the steps that I did and in trying to get the place set up, I asked the UN what are the rules and regulations in terms of the bureaucracy, and I received no help at all. And I think what happened then with me making these decisions and moving the place forward, and things were happening very quickly and needed urgent decisions, so we couldn't wait around for New York to give their stamp of approval. So I think I started getting noses out of joint by making decisions and moving the process along. And New York, I think, felt that they were losing control, and they regarded me as a bit of a renegade maybe, who was breaking UN rules. And so it's in the book, but there was a period very early in 1994 when I was in The Hague that the UN suspended my salary. My wife and family were living in Sydney and depended on me to send my salary home so that they could survive in Australia. And then my salary just dried up and no one could tell me why that happened. And months went by when this situation occurred. It forced me to borrow money from my good colleagues, Bob Reid and John Ralston, who's here today, so I could send money back to Australia. And there was this occasion when I was in New York and I asked to see my personal file, and they took me around to where these things were kept, and they showed me the file, and when it was opened up, right on top of the pile of documents was a big note saying withhold Blewitt's pay, which shocked me and shocked the person that was showing me the file. So he said, that doesn't look right, let me see if I can fix this up. Anyway, within a few days I started to receive my salary again and the back pay, and I was able to repay my friends. The only reason I can think of as why that happened was that they were trying to force my resignation so that they in New York could gain control of this creature that they had created in The Hague. But by then it was too late. They'd lost any control of the place, and I was left to do all the damage that I could do.
So what was harder, battling bureaucrats or war criminals?
Well, once the battle was won with the bureaucrats, then I think we could turn our attention to the war criminals.
Well, of course, you had a lot of responsibility at the beginning. You were the deputy, but then you basically ran the place, and because the first appointee bailed out, didn't he? And then, so that setting up the structure was your initial responsibility. How much has that been sustained?
Luckily, I had the experiences getting to The Hague with being at the National Crime Authority, which operated very much on a multidisciplinary team basis, so I had that experience. And then the SIU doing the Nazi war crimes, so I had that experience as well. So basically, when I looked at the task ahead of me when I arrived in The Hague, I knew I had to set up an office, and it was fairly basic. The Tribunal was tasked with both investigating and prosecuting war criminals. So logically, you needed an investigation division to do the investigations, a prosecution division to do the prosecutions, and all the support functions around that. So it was a fairly easy design, but I designed it, and that design was carried through to the Tribunal for the Rwanda, and then incorporated into the Permanent International Criminal Court. They have the same basic structure, and as far as I know, the various other tribunals that have been set up for Sierra Leone, Lebanon, have followed the same basic structure. So I think that structure I set up has stood the test of time, despite the fact that the third prosecutor, Carla Del Ponte, tried to tip it on its head. And I invite you to read the book called The Poison Well in Chapter 6, which describes her unsuccessful attempts to dismantle the structure that I had created.
Lots of Australians beyond yourself, probably not quite fair to call it a kangaroo court, I take it. But tell me about why so many Australians and what was the contribution of the Aussies?
Now I can talk a long time about this. I'll start by answering your questions, Chris, with a comment that was made to me many years ago when I was in The Hague by a lady who was the special assistant to the prosecutor. Mary Fisk was her name. She was a UN career person, and unfortunately she died this year of cancer. Lovely lady. But she once told me that there's a well-known fact within the UN organisation that if you needed something done within the UN, you give it to an Australian, which I found quite encouraging. But luckily when I went to The Hague, and with all the difficulties I had in recruiting staff by following the UN bureaucratic rules, I obtained permission to start recruiting quickly. So what I did, I picked up the phone and I rang my colleagues, not only Australians, but there were some British, American and Canadian and colleagues, Scottish as well, but also the Australians who I had worked with in the Nazi war crimes field. And to my eternal gratitude, these people who had good careers in their own countries, I phoned them up and said, would you like to join me in The Hague investigating war crimes? Knowing that they all had successful careers, and I was asking them to give up such a career and come to The Hague to join an enterprise that was untested and there was no real expectation that it would succeed. But luckily for me, these people came, and they came in droves. And within a few months, I was able to recruit about 24 people that I had worked with doing Nazi war crimes investigations. So these people came with all their experience. And one of them is here today, John Ralston, my very good confidant and friend. John and Bob Reed. Grant Neiman also, he was the Deputy DPP in Adelaide who was responsible for putting all the cases, Nazi cases, before the Adelaide courts. He joined me as well. And in the end, we had quite a few Australians who I was able to rely on. I knew them, they knew me, we trusted each other, and it just made those early days very, very easy. And when I wanted to recruit more Australians, I was then confronted with the UN bureaucratic rules that there were limitations on the number of people any one country can have working for the UN. The test was how much money did each country pay to the UN by way of regular donations or regular contributions. The more money a country paid, the more they could expect that their staff would be recruited by the UN. Unfortunately, Australia's contribution to the UN was such that the quota was full and I was not able to recruit as many Australians as I wanted. I had a bit of success when Grant Neiman left and returned to Australia, and I was able to recruit Mark Aarons, who's in this room somewhere. Oh, there he is over there. So I was able to maintain that level of Australian staff on the basis that, well, there was a quota and I could live up to that quota. But then more Australians started to come by secondments and donations, and Nick Cowdery, the former DPP and former president of the International Association of Prosecutors, allowed his staff to go on leave to be seconded to the tribunal, and at least one of those people are here today, Julia. And so I'm eternally grateful for the number of Australians who were there. They really made a difference, and I can be very proud of the contribution that Australians made to that entire effort.
What is a potted history of international cooperation? How has it waxed and waned?
International cooperation. Well, in terms of the creation of the tribunal, the Yugoslav tribunal, that was created by the Security Council with a unanimous vote for the resolution that created it, including China and Russia. These days, however, with what's happening around the world, the Security Council is not what it used to be, and we have Russia, who is a permanent member of the Security Council, able to veto resolutions, as does China, that might see more peace in this world being established, particularly in Ukraine and now what's happening in Israel and the Gaza Strip. So I think from my point of view, Chris, I've noticed there's been a deterioration in international cooperation. Back in the 90s, it was more strong.
Mm-hmm. And without the support of the United States, Russia, Israel, how effective can it be?
If the Security Council is able, or if the Security Council is to do what it was set up to do, then it needs all permanent members to be singing from the same page. This veto power that has been used too often is something that I believe needs to be reviewed and changed, because what's the point of having a Security Council to bring international peace and security if only one member can abstain from voting? It's a joke.
Would you like to see Putin in the dock?
Absolutely, and he will be in the dock. I feel that in my bones that he'll end up in The Hague. Maybe not this year or next year, but yeah, they'll get him eventually. The same with Milosevic. People said when we indicted Milosevic, you'll never get him in The Hague. All it took was one election, Milosevic to lose that election, and guess what? He ended up in The Hague.
Mm-hmm. What is the big fish, little fish dynamic? I know from my experience recently with the Ben Robert Smith case, all alleged war criminals from the Australian participation in the Afghanistan conflict are corporals or below. It's actually been very, very hard to get the fingerprints of any senior officers. So what do you think about that? How do you prioritise your prosecutions?
Well, when the Yugoslav tribunal first started, the war was ongoing and there were atrocities being committed every day. And the question was, well, first of all, we were set up to investigate and prosecute those most responsible for what was happening in the Balkans. And of course that meant the political leaders and the military leaders. So our very primary targets right from the outset were people like Radovan Karadzic, Slobodan Milosevic, Ratko Mladic, all the people that the international community, the international media, and the ordinary person in the street regarded as being the architects of the war. So they were our primary targets. The tribunal in those days, however, had no credibility. The countries making up the former Yugoslavia were never going to cooperate fully with the tribunal. So we knew that we would not get witnesses to come out and start testifying against people like Karadzic, Mladic and Milosevic. Rather, we had to prove in a court that they were in fact responsible for the crimes, and to do that we knew that we first had to establish what crimes had been committed. So a lot of our investigative efforts were devoted to documenting the crimes, documenting who was responsible for them at that level, who was pulling the triggers and who were their commanders. So in that sense, it was a ground-up approach in our belief that we would eventually work our way up this chain of command to prosecute those leaders. And in the end, that's what in fact happened. But a lot of time was devoted to investigating the crimes and the lower level perpetrators, the small fish, if you like. But the world was becoming impatient with the tribunal. It had been created. There were these 11 judges sitting there, not doing anything, and they were encouraging us to get a move on and indict people. And so we decided to keep them happy. We started indicting a few of the lower level perpetrators, the small fish, if you want to call them. But we did that deliberately, one, to shut the judges up, but secondly, to get the mechanisms and the mechanics of the tribunal working, so that if there was any faults in the system, we could iron those faults out before the big fish actually arrived. So there were then a series of prosecutions of these. People would regard them as small fish. But even though they were tagged as small fish, these were people who had committed horrendous crimes, committed, murders, murdering hundreds of people. And so in any judicial system, they were worthy of prosecution. So the small fish, big fish debate was more, I think, for the academics rather than those dealing with the practicalities and the realities of the situation on the ground. And in my view, that's the only way you're ever going to prosecute political and military leaders, unless you've got someone at higher levels willing to give evidence against them. We didn't have that, so we had to build up, and eventually when we got up the higher levels, then higher level witnesses, important witnesses, started to come out of the woodwork, enabling us to then prosecute. So I think in the SAS situation with Afghanistan, I think the OSI, that's the only way they can go.
Yeah.
If there's a will to do it, I should add.
One of the lawyers working for us actually had worked at The Hague, Chris Mitchell, and I remember him saying to me that his experience from The Hague was that you've got to get the evidence, Chris. The evidence matters much more than testimony. If you dig up a grave and you see wrist bones manacled by wire, it's pretty clear that that's been an execution. And he went on to discover his skills were absolutely critical to the outcome of that case. Now, you set up the records and information section, didn't you? So how important was that, the process of gathering evidence?
When I went to The Hague, I'd come from Australia, not so much the work of the SAU, but with the prosecutions with the Joint Drug Task Forces and the National Crime Authority. I was acutely aware of the need to ensure that the evidence could never be challenged because it could be alleged that someone had interfered with the evidence or the chain of custody. So in my view, it was critically important in The Hague that there would be no opportunity for anybody to suggest that any evidence that the prosecution was tendering in court had somehow been tainted or manufactured or fabricated. So I put in place, which is described more fully in the book, and I'm not going to bore you with the details, but a mechanism which I believed would ensure the integrity of any piece of evidence that came into our door, that we could always point to the original document, where it came from, how we got it, where we got it from, who the author was, and that original document was to be locked away so no one could get access to it unless they were authorised to do so. And we scanned all the documents. Every page had a unique number, and the staff were able to, through their computers, get access to any document that they needed. They could print it, they could electronically put it into a brief. But I went there, I guess, stung with the things that had happened in Australia where allegations of fabrication and manufactured evidence was fairly regularly put up in court in these big cases, and I wanted to make sure that in our cases in The Hague there would be no opportunity to challenge our evidence. So it was critically important in my view.
I remember I saw that thing on the ABC only last week. Ben Ferenz, and he, prior to Nuremberg, he went looking for the files. You know, you think of Hannah Arendt's comment, the banality of evil, and it was all recorded, appallingly so, but also extremely helpful for that matter. Do you continue to see that, the banality of evil?
Certainly, yes, but those committing such evil are not making the sort of records that the Nazis did.
No.
That Conrad revelled in the archives, searching for these Nazi documents, which meticulously recorded everything that they did, and sometimes it was disguised in language that was not quite apparent what they were talking about, but it didn't take much effort to realise what they were talking about, namely the number of victims that they had murdered. These days you don't see that. I'd be very surprised. We didn't see that in Yugoslavia, although we did find some records, and John Ralston led a couple of search warrant exercises in Bosnia and recovered some remarkable pieces of evidence which we were able to use. But they weren't documenting what they were doing in the same way that the Nazis did. What Israel is doing, my guess is they might be documenting it to justify their actions if and when any prosecutions come for their disproportionate attack on the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. But finding documents, if they exist, is a key to any investigation, and wherever those documents exist, if you can find them, that's going to be very, very important.
And how do you avoid victors' justice, the most common criticism of war crimes tribunals?
That was thrown at us in The Hague, that what we were doing was victors' justice, but the simple answer to that was, well, who are the victors here? We're investigating, first of all, the war is still ongoing, so there's no victor here. Plus, we were investigating all parties that were involved in the conflict. We weren't picking those who were the losers, if you like. So I think that's the only way you can do it, where you've got competing sides in a conflict. You investigate anyone who's committed crimes. And whereas if you, like what happened at the end of the Second World War, obviously the Allies were the clear victors, and they were prosecuting the Nazi perpetrators, so it was easy to tag that experience as victors' justice, but I don't accept that that's what it was.
No. Obviously, dispiriting, demoralising subject to live with. You're a bit like an investigative reporter, aren't you? You know, you go through this stuff, you carry that baggage. What does it do to your soul?
I think for those involved in the investigation and the prosecution side of things, there are incidents that impact on you emotionally and psychologically. But in terms of what impact it has on our soul, I think we believe that we're doing the right thing and seeking justice for the victims. I don't think you can say the same for the perpetrators who are being prosecuted and investigated. How they come to terms with living what they did, it's hard to say, but there was at least one encouraging incident at the tribunal, and a man named Dragan Adamovic, a young man who was involved in the mass executions of that constituted the Srebrenica genocide. He was a shooter. He killed, I don't know how many people he killed, but hundreds of people. And after this had occurred, he was in Serbia and just couldn't live with himself. His conscience was such that he felt he had to confess to what he had done. And he was intending to surrender himself to the tribunal with the assistance of some British BBC journalists who were trying to smuggle him out of Serbia. The Serbian Secret Service found out about this and attempted to capture him, and he was shot in the stomach in the process. I found out about this, and again it's documented in the book. Shortly after he was arrested, and with some other staff, immediately, it was on a weekend, we prepared some official requests to be sent to Milosevic, indicating that we knew about this man and we wanted to interview him as a potential witness. Anyway, that was successful. He eventually came to The Hague. He pleaded guilty, was sentenced, and he subsequently gave evidence in several trials involving the military and political commanders involved in the Srebrenica genocide. So there was a person whose soul had been affected so much that he couldn't live with himself.
Yeah.
And he felt he had to do the right thing.
So on the other side of the ledger, there are those inspiring stories that restore your faith. I know that in the Ben Robert-Smith saga, one of the soldiers told a story of witnessing the execution of an Afghan being kicked off the cliff. He said as he spun down, his face hit the inner wall and his teeth sprayed out. He hit the ground unconscious. 3 Australian soldiers walked down. The man staggers to his feet, gaining consciousness, and they shoot him dead. I have to say, when I first heard that story, I was shocked and somewhat naively thought, I don't think Australians do those things. It's such a demoralising tale, and it's become a critical one. But it was also redemptive to some degree to think that one of the SAS soldiers, as soon as he first heard that story, he spoke up. He tried to have something done about it. He put his whole career on the line. One of the soldiers who witnessed it couldn't get that image out of his head of the man hitting his face hitting the cliff. Every time he put his head on the pillow, it would come back. And in court, the soldier who elevated the inquiry, the defence didn't want to know anything about it, tried to cover it up. I mean, at that level. At another level, of course, they investigated. But I remember that soldier in court saying, if you hear something like that, how can you forget it? How can you not do something about it? So it is encouraging. But there's also, I mean, one of the things that I've never been able to understand is how 4 people can witness something like that. 2 of them will sustain those memories forever. The experience actually changes their life, and then 2 others can walk away from it without even thinking about it. There is a lot of psychological fallout, not only among the victims and their families, but there are second and third order effects everywhere, aren't they? It can ruin the reputation of a nation. It can exhaust a people, the evil of war. Yeah.
I can only acknowledge what you say, Chris, and I applaud your efforts in trying to shed light on the actions of Ben Robert-Smith and others of his ilk. It's one just has to wonder where humanity can go. It seems to me there's a very thin veneer of humanity, and you only have to scratch it a bit, and you see the evil that lies beneath it.
Talk about don't mention the war, and you have mentioned it, the current Israel-Palestine Hamas conflict. Do you see any resolution through prospective future war crimes prosecutions?
I do. I believe there will be prosecutions of both Hamas and Israeli perpetrators, if it can be established that they've committed war crimes. I really don't want to go into that. If I can indicate, Chris, that I just note the time.
Okay.
We've got a couple of options here, folks. We have to finish at 4 o'clock and it's now 3:45. We are able to pass a microphone around for someone to ask a question if there are any questions. If there are not, Chris is, I think, quite...
If we do that, then I have to ask you not to tell stories. What normally happens, but only a very short, precise question, if you agree for it.
Yes, of course, comrades, yes. Okay. So I've only got 15 minutes, so does anyone... Yeah, we do have a question. So, young Noah, my next door neighbour. Noah, can you grab the phone off Josh, please?
Are you handling it? Do you want to handle it?
Yeah, I'll take care of it. You can relax, Conrad. Just here, Ludmila's got a question. Noah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Graham, for just touching upon the tip of an iceberg. My question, as you can anticipate, is about communication through interpreters. So there were certain problems during the Australian war crimes prosecutions. What are the lessons that you yourself and your colleagues have learned when you had to go to The Hague and investigate and then try the cases of the former Yugoslavia, where in a tribunal where communication entirely relied on interpretation?
Well, all I can say, Ludmila, is that it's a critically important question. To answer it fully, it would take me the next 15 minutes to do so. Ludmila was right. When we were doing the Nazi war crimes prosecutions in Adelaide, the interpretation process in the court was a real problem. We were bringing witnesses from remote Ukraine. These were peasants who had never left their village their entire lives. And here we were, we picked them up, took them to London, then to Singapore, then to Adelaide, and exposed them to all the joys of life in Australia. And they were then in the courtroom and were being asked questions by a Queen's Counsel who was asking questions as if he was asking someone who had lived in Australia all their lives. And there was this disconnect, and it was quite easy in front of the jury to, I guess, make the witnesses look lacking credit because there were these cultural and language problems. So it was quite a difficult experience for us. We went to The Hague, and I think the standard of interpreters engaged by the tribunal was very high class. And the only other thing I want to say about it was that it was not consecutive interpreting, but simultaneous interpretations. So the witness would just be talking, and the interpreter was off in a booth somewhere in translating or interpreting from one language to another without anyone being aware of that process. But we found in the investigations of the war crimes, our interpreters dealing with the witnesses, when we were interviewing them, these people who had been through the conflict themselves and were victims themselves. So every time, on behalf of an investigator, they were interpreting, they themselves were being re-traumatised by listening to the horrors of the stories that were being told. But Ludmila is a professor at the University of New South Wales and has written countless papers on this whole topic, and they're on the websites. I'm sure they can be found. Very illuminating. For me to go into any detail would just occupy the next hour, so I'm afraid, Ludmila, I can't answer you any more than that. Any other questions? Yes, there's two at the back there, Noah, thank you. You go first, Ashley.
Mr. Blewitt and Mr. Masters, thank you both for your insights. My question is coloured by my context as a young practitioner. What advice would you give to a young practitioner interested in pursuing this work? Namely, what skills, such as investigative skills, cross-jurisdictional issues, or even the ability to have empathy for your witnesses and victims, what advice would you give a practitioner?
Gosh, going back to 1994, it was very difficult getting people to come to The Hague. But now people would give their right arm and their right leg to get a job at any tribunal. So there's been this huge shift in this jurisdiction for people to practice in. I could say what you had to do in 1994, 95 and 96 to get a job in The Hague. Now, I wouldn't have a clue. There are so many talented young lawyers out there, any one of them able to perform at the highest level. I was almost embarrassed when I was in The Hague when I saw the quality of the lawyers that were coming into the prosecutor's office. I thought, my God, if I had to apply to a job based on my legal skills, I'd still be at the end of the queue. But I was lucky I got in first. So, but now there are so many people. The international criminal law is now an enforceable body of law. It's sexy, people want to get involved in it, and I can understand that and I admire that. But there are so many people trying to get into so few jobs, it's very difficult. So I don't know, Ashley, that I could give anyone any advice as to how to do it. Just look for opportunities. Whenever there's an opportunity, grab it with both hands, and if it works out, it works out. If it doesn't, try something else. I think.
Okay, hello. I was wondering, can you envision a time in the not so distant future where you will not be needed? Like this, you won't be needed. Like, can you see humanity? Like, is there something that you've learnt that you can pass on so you are not needed? My background is Greek Cypriot, and it's, they aren't killing each other now, but they're still, the divided city. But can you, through your experience and what you have seen, is there anything that, can you see this ever?
Yep.
Yeah.
I should say, folks, that's Eva, and Eva's the lady who took the photograph that appears in my book and on my website. I'll encourage you to have a look at my website. Sorry, Chris. Eva, when I left the tribunal, I was really encouraged. When we started at the tribunal, I was told that we had to succeed because if we failed, the world would not see the creation of a permanent international criminal court. So that was an added burden that was placed on us. And it was our belief that with the creation of a permanent court, there would be a permanent deterrent for people committing genocide and crimes against humanity. And when I left the tribunal in 2004, the ICC was the permanent court was a reality. And I thought at last there is a permanent deterrent and we won't see these sorts of crimes anymore. Well, I've been wrong. Can I see a time when that is not the situation? I can't see it, in all honesty. Human beings being human beings, and people with greed for power, and unless there's a permanent and positive court that is able to bring these people without the interference of politics, that an independent court that has the universal jurisdiction, that can go in and arrest with their own arrest powers people who have committed crimes, as if it was a police force within a state like New South Wales. If you could replicate that on the international stage, then it would stop because there is a real deterrent. But now, look what Putin's doing. Even though I believe he will end up in The Hague, he doesn't think he will. He's got complete immunity, he thinks, for what he's doing in Ukraine. So I'd like to believe that a time will come when we can all live in peace and harmony and there's real justice for victims, but it's not going to happen in my lifetime. Any more questions? Yes, there's one at the back. Billy Bell's got a question.
I'd
An Aboriginal question. Oh my goodness.
Do you think that the Aboriginal atrocities occurred in this country will ever get put in court?
In court?
Well,
No, they're all dead, Billy.
well, they are. I'm talking about the wars of the Aboriginal people that have never ever been recognised in this country. The thousands and thousands and thousands of people that got killed. So I know we don't even want to talk about the history of the Aboriginal people, but do you think those wars will ever be spoken about?
One of my biggest disappointments this year, Billy, was the results in the referendum.
Me too.
Like, what can you say? I can't answer your question, Billy.
I didn't think you could, mate.
I wish I could.
Chris can answer.
I just a couple of reflections. David Marr's written a terrific book, Killing for Country. So I think recognition is growing, and of course there's the argument at the Australian War Memorial about recognising frontier wars. I think inevitably that will happen, and of course it should happen. We were talking before about the credibility of witnesses. I thought that there was some sort of parallel in a way with, for example, in the Afghanistan matter. One of the reasons these atrocities occurred was that because nobody thought that Afghan witnesses had credibility or would ever be called to a court. They just didn't see a process like that occurring. They sort of thought of them, I think, as less than human. It was one of the things that really angered me, to think that Australian soldiers could do these things and then come back to their country and be completely untroubled by the notion that these injustices had occurred. As it turned out, some of the best witnesses in the Ben Roberts-Smith matter, very, very hard to get them, because we had to get them on a video link, and this occurred only weeks before the Kabul fell. They turned out to be terrific witnesses, really compelling. Now, with the frontier wars, Indigenous Australians never gave evidence. They were never called to give evidence. They weren't regarded as credible. I think that's shocking, and I don't think. I think if anything like that happens again, of course, that can't be sustained.
Tim.
This is following from the previous set of questions, and it's really a question for both of you. You mentioned at the start of this talk the presence of Russia and China with veto powers in the Security Council. And obviously the Ben Roberts-Smith defamation case is a quasi-war crimes case, racked up 30 million in costs. There was an access to justice issue there. From the perspective of an international legal framework, what are the core principles that the UN will need to maintain to ensure that war criminals moving forward are always held accountable?
The invitation was to you as well, Chris. Do you want to go first? You don't? Bugger. Well, I think it's fairly clear, Tim, that the crimes are well known and established. There's genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. The elements of those crimes are well known. So it's easy to identify when those crimes are being committed. So it seems to me that if the UN is to have any role to play in bringing to justice perpetrators of such crimes, then it's very easy for them to identify the fact that the crimes are happening, and they need the ability to be able to say, this is not good enough, something has to be done about it. And so they therefore take a step to ensure that there is accountability by either referring the matter to the ICC, and if the Security Council does that, the ICC is then seized of that jurisdiction, regardless of whether the country committing the crimes is a party to the court or not, or it sets up an ad hoc tribunal like it did with the Yugoslav tribunal. So I think the principles are there. What is lacking is the political will to do something about it.
So that brings us to an end of, I must admit, absolutely stunning, intriguing, and for me, almost mind-blowing event which I've witnessed today. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for both for this presentation, and I wish you all the best and happy Christmas.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very, very much.